Hello and welcome to Grody UnPrOfesSiOnAL. My name is Justin McMenamy, and my mission is to share both profitable and painful leadership lessons I have acquired over a 20-year career as a misfit in corporate America. In this episode, I sit down with Justin Kauffman and discuss everything from market category creation to the agronomy of planting plum trees on the sides of pyramids. Today, I am joined by a longtime friend and former colleague, Justin Kauffman. Now, Mr. Kauffman, I cannot imagine that you have ever been associated with the word Grody or unprofessional, but I am greatly appreciative of your time to join us here today to discuss your passions, your experience, and your lessons on leadership.
Well, it's fun to be here to have a conversation. Obviously, we have had the opportunity to work together quite a bit. I believe you know me well enough that there probably are some times where I could have fit either of those definitions, but I appreciate the fact that it might be limited, hopefully.
As with every guest, I want you to be the one to admit that, not me that admits that.
Yeah, fully admitted.
All right. Let's start off here. Just tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background, both personally and professionally.
Yeah. So I'd say I'm mid-career. I love business building. I've had the opportunity to be part of Precision Planting, obviously, where you and I got to spend a lot of time together growing that business up. But really before that, I had the opportunity to watch a father work in corporate America and pursue that path, as well as some family that were more entrepreneurial and just recognize that I thought my giftings and passions were around that early stage business building. And that's what I have pursued with my career. I got the advice early on. I don't even know who to give credit to for this, but that, if you want to understand entrepreneurship, spend some time in sales because every business needs to transact. And the best business in the world, if it can't interact with a customer in a way that they can make a profit, meaning in the most pure sense of that, right? And so getting some time in sales and marketing and understanding customers and how that all goes down, no matter what business I think I'm going to build in the future, would be really valuable. So coming out of college, that's what I did. I kind of got into more sales roles and really enjoyed having to get out there and understand, how do we understand customer needs? How do I understand my company was in engineering services. And so we're, helping to do that. But from there, I really love leading people. I love being able to push into that. It's over the course of my career, I have moved into more people leading roles to help clarify vision, where are we headed, equip a team, and have really spent a lot of time. I'm still a student of that. Right. And still a student of understanding organizations and how they work and how to care for and lead employees, as well as never taking the eye off the customer and really being obsessed about that. Yeah.
And I would say from spending time with you, you are probably one of the biggest students of the game of leadership. Talk to me a little bit about the origin of that passion.
Yeah.
You said you had your dad worked in a large organization, you had some entrepreneurs, but really your passion behind the leadership of people, the leadership of mission. What would you attest that to?
Yeah. I'm not fully sure.
Okay.
Right? As the pure student, I think I'm still studying that. First and foremost, every organization, you realize pretty quickly in today's world, people are very core to it. Now, I think there's a whole lot here that we could go into about what does that mean? Are people actually an asset, or what's the right way to think about them? But at the end of the day, doing anything is not necessarily about just my own ability to pull something off or have the right answer.
Yeah.
I think maybe part of this came with just a security in myself that was willing to know where my edges are. I have come to see Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger picture of the circle of competency.
Okay.
That I think has been very helpful for me, which essentially, if you can visualize the circle of, here's my competency, what I really know well and what I'm really good at. And then outside a larger circle around my circle of competency is my circle of concern. What matters, what's important to me. It's actually not about having the largest circle of competency. We kind of, I think we're kind of bred into that way that I want to be the smartest. I want to know the right answer all the time.
On the most subjects, across the most markets. It's all about making myself a broader person.
Correct.
Right?
Compared to saying the most important thing I can do is understand where my line of my circle of competency ends.
Right.
How far do I go in my circle of concern? Not worry about things outside of that.
Yep.
But look to connect with the right people to fill that gap. I think organizations thinking that way typically are the healthiest and most successful. And that's kind of was an outflow of me in a personal development.
Yeah. I think the first time I came across that similar concept, it didn't come from Munger and Buffett, but it actually came in the training I took on strengths finders.
Yeah.
And so they've got these 34 whatever strengths, and you check the boxes and this and that and the other. And what comes back is a list ranked 1 through 34 of some version of your preferences, some version of your skill, some version of your experience, depends on who you talk to, how you talk about it. But I remember the person giving the class saying a lot of people are tempted to go to the bottom 5 and say, these are the 5 things that I need to work on. When in reality, the more effective way to go about it is to look at the top 5 and say, understand the environments that these top 5 play well.
Yeah.
And understand the situations where these don't play well and look to have others in the organization, whether it be a small organization or a large organization, play to your weakness. So who are you pairing yourself with in these projects that their strengths and your strengths line up? That was really for me the first time that I kind of thought, man, I don't have to be best at all 34 of these things. I need to be aware of where my gaps are, but I don't need to go spend years trying to cover them myself.
Yeah.
I need to look to coworkers. I need to look to peers to help cover those. And you got to be in an organization that allows you to raise your hand and say, hey, this isn't a strength of mine. Because there are certain organizations where they just flat out expect you to be the best at all of those situations.
Right. And I think by, our human nature, it's tough to admit that we're not.
Yeah.
It's tough to admit that, someone else is better than me at that. And maybe it's not tough for some people. For me, it is. And I think, within our culture, that can be a difficult thing. And then definitely organizations can make that even worse.
Yeah.
Right. Even by some of the structures that we put in place and some of the ways we're reviewing people and evaluating people, we're actually making a lot of that even worse.
Right.
I do think strength finders, as an example, for me was a part individualization, developer were a few of my higher strengths. Along with belief. Individualization ends up being, as I've dealt with strength finders a lot now, a little bit more unique one that is all about loving and having a strength and understanding the unique aspects of each individual and what they need to leadership.
Yeah. My favorite strengths finder story comes from actually the first time I took strengths finders. I was in a division and it was at a large organization. And for whatever reason, I could never get on the same page with the division manager. Every meeting we had, I could tell that my behavior frustrated him. And I knew personally that as I left, I was frustrated with his behavior. And so the whole division goes through strengths finders. And in one division meeting, he puts his 34, 1 through 34, he puts them on the wall. And I kid you not, my number 1 was communication and his number 34 was communication. His number 1 was deliberation and my number 34 was deliberation. And so we would sit in this meeting and I fancy myself a good communicator and I don't like to sit here and talk about it for hours on end. I like to be succinct. I like to say what needs to be said, make a decision and move on. And he'd like to just sit there and think about it and talk about it. And he wasn't good at communicating it back. And so there was just this spiral that would happen every time we interacted. And honestly, seeing it on the wall was an opportunity for me to understand this is an opportunity to extend patience, to extend grace. This isn't an opportunity to say he's different than me and so we can't work together. It actually made it easier to work with him, knowing that he wasn't just intentionally trying to rile me up in that way. And so I know there's a lot of, you can really try to take a too fine of a cut with a thing like a strengths finders. Yeah. I do think at a high level, it's been helpful for me.
I agree. And I think, to probably be grody and unprofessional to the whole industry that creates those type of things.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of debate and I'm sure research, and I'm sure there's plenty of people that could, talk circles around me on.
But they're not invited to this podcast.
That's right.
It doesn't matter.
That's right. They're too professional. And the value to me has always been this just framework for conversation.
Yes.
It's imperfect. Every one of these assessments is probably imperfect. I think one of the areas I've grown in a ton more recently is like understanding context. Everything is is contextual without becoming relative. And,
Yes.
there's a level to take that. But we can say when we look at things like, oh, I'm an introvert or an extrovert, or some of the earlier assessments. Well, I think we all know people, and I resonate with this personally. In some scenarios, I'm extremely extroverted. In other scenarios, I'm actually very introverted.
On the same day.
On the same day.
Yep.
The big value of all those assessments is that it creates an opportunity for that conversation to happen, for you to realize, yeah, that's why we're having such oil and water.
Yes.
If I just look at these, what's top for me is bottom for him, and vice versa. And now we have a framework to, be able to have some conversations. That becomes the value of those assessments.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's transition a little bit. I know, having worked with you at Precision Planting being a company that you or I weren't the founder of the business, but there was a founder that created an entirely new category inside of agriculture, inside of ag tech, which was to provide technology in a unique way to the market in a disruptive price point that actually brought customers into the market that couldn't otherwise afford to be there. Then from there, you've moved to your current venture, which similarly looks at an industry and says, I think there's an opportunity to present a product to the customer in a way that is meaningful and interesting and new, that actually can bring new customers into a marketplace. And so one of the ways that kind of gets described academically or gets described in literature is the concept of category creation. Help us understand, what is category creation?
Yeah. What's interesting is we were in the earlier stages at Precision. And as you mentioned, I mean, I won't pretend to take credit for the idea, the initial vision of disruption that occurred there, but was able to come in at I think a really neat inflection point, along with you, of being part of growth. And now looking back on it, I would put the idea of category creation as being probably the most singularly important aspect of the impact that business has made. Now, with the caveat of, it takes a ton of great people, and, I'll talk a ton about culture and how the organizational health and those things are all extremely critical.
Yes.
However, I would say, I do believe even the most healthy team selling a subpar product into a market that doesn't need it is not going to make that big of an impact.
It's an ingredient in the stew, right? You have to have aspects of all these things, whether it be execution, whether it be culture, whether it be product. Exactly.
Right. And so I remember, you go back to 2015 with Precision Planting, and there's an agreement for John Deere to buy the business, and it gets blocked by the Department of Justice. And it's kind of this surreal moment, because you're sitting there saying, there's a group of us here in Tremont, Illinois, outside of Peoria, on the location of the farm, the founder, on his farm. And you're like, I think we're kind of smart. I think we are actually pretty strategic. But what? Really? The Department of Justice is blocking John Deere, this 150-year story business, from buying our technology, our business. Why would that be? And at that same time, I remember the quote from a John Deere executive that says, Precision Planting is our number one competitor.
Right.
And you said, how did this happen?
And at that time, the revenue of John Deere would have been thousands of times larger than Precision Planting. Absolutely.
And you're like, how can I really make sense of that? We don't sell tractors or combines or even full planters. But you look at it and ultimately say, why were we so disruptive? And what had we done is we had changed the conversation in the interest of by definition of category.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we mean by that, I think, first off, you say, what do we do as consumers? First and foremost, we largely buy on category first.
Yeah.
Okay. Not brand, not even product, but category first. And
so what would be an example of that, Justin?
So I like to think about the grocery store.
Yeah.
It's as you walk into a grocery store, look above, and what do you see? You see categories. You see peanut butter. You see juice. You don't see brand names. Everything is the way it is because somebody changed the way it was.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there was a day where there was no frozen food,
mm-hmm.
and somebody created the category of frozen food,
mm-hmm.
right? And so if I follow that example down, we say, I need something for dinner, and this week, and I'm going to put some stuff in the freezer, and so I go to the frozen food section, and then I say I want, I further move into that, and I want frozen pizza.
Mm-hmm.
And then I get to a brand experience like DiGiorno or whoever, or Jack's, depending on what I'm after. Grody UnPrOfEsSiOnAL. I don't know which one would be the right on-brand version.
Totino's.
The Totino's.
We're Totino's here.
Makes sense. That's right. So, but that's the idea. We buy category first, and then it ends up being that, as a company, when you're changing that narrative, category's got to be started with an obsession about a customer need, not because, I created something neat, but ultimately it's really helping a customer some way. And I'm helping teach them about that, what is that problem and how this solution helps them. And then ultimately some business or brand typically becomes the definition of that category.
Right.
I should reference that even the words I'm using. There's a book, Play Bigger.
Yeah.
That helped bring definition to a lot of this.
Yeah.
That uses the idea and that, talks about category king, category creation. Now, in all fairness, they're building upon multiple other work. If you go back to 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing, there's law number 2, I think, is the law of category.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't lead in one, you create a new category, right? Play Bigger really does a great job of expanding upon that work and getting more practical and tactical and how to do that. And I do just look at that being such an exciting thing in business. It's what I love doing as I look back on it. It's what we did at Precision. And we weren't necessarily using those words at the time. But if I look back on it, it's like, there were great products. There was a great team. There was great sales approaches. There was all these things. And there's a level of disruption that we were doing in that we were creating this new category. And there's a ton of fun. Like you mentioned, I'm getting to do that again. It's part of why I'm excited about this new season. I see another area now with a little more clarity that we get to push into. With a lot of these, I find myself saying experience plus theory is really the only way experience is worthwhile, as well as theory. Yeah. I think we can kind of go too far on either side. Right. A lot of times over the years, as I read or study, it's, you take this book or this work and look to apply it to your real world experience to really validate some of, where this is applying or not. And in the same way, sometimes looking back at experience and be like, how did that actually happen that way? How did this really, how did we actually pull that off?
To try to understand what mechanisms were at work, even though you didn't necessarily understand it.
Correct.
In situ, you may have thought, well, it's because of the great engineering team or it's because of the great sales team. But you get 5 years hence and you look back and you're like, those are true. Those aspects are true. But there was this other tidal force underneath us that we weren't noticing.
Right.
One of the examples that they use, I think, in the book Play Bigger is Airbnb.
Right.
And its category creation as a near category to the hotels.
Right.
Airbnb was spawned out of the belief of these guys wanted to go to a concert and there was no hotels available and they knew there was a couch somewhere in the city,
San Francisco,
San Francisco, that they could provide for somebody coming into town. It was a new category, but it was not because they walked in saying, today's the day we invent a new category. Yeah. It's that they saw a need that a current customer was underserved by an existing market approach.
Yeah.
And so really kind of starting at the core, the underserved customer is really oftentimes what spawns that new category idea.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I do think there's a couple different ways in. You took it like Airbnb and Uber are solving problems that you would say we knew, what's the right way to say this, that we knew we had, but didn't think there was a solution for.
Right.
So it's like if you would ask anybody, hey, do you love taxis? Do you love traveling to San Francisco and getting a taxi? Nobody would have been like, yeah, I absolutely love the taxi industry. Sorry for all your taxi listeners. But
there's at least one.
Yeah. But what's my other option?
Right.
I didn't have another option. Or Airbnb. It's like, it's not a full on assault to the hotel industry.
Correct.
Hilton and Marriott are still doing fine. But you have really created this different category. It's like, and then that's where as a business leader, that's what's so important. I mean, if Uber would have just been like, hey, we got an app platform that we're going to sell to all the taxi companies. That would be an idea of saying, I'm not creating a new category. I'm just going to try to
add efficiency to an existing category.
Correct. Right. Most companies say, I'm going to make some new technology and go sell it to the OEMs, those original equipment manufacturers, and have them put it in their factory so that it's their equipment is now better. And that's totally missing the point. Yeah. That's not the fun of category creation. That's not creating a ripple in time about changing how customers are actually going to experience and look to make decisions on what they do. So back to Uber, it's rideshare. It's not better taxi service.
Right.
It's actually something fundamentally different.
Right. How hard is it to do category creation within an existing company? And even worse, an existing successful company?
I think it is extremely hard is probably an understatement.
Right, because the entire system is built around 100%. The optimization of the current business model, of the current customer, kind of better serving the current customer. And that's in resource allocation, that's in hiring, that's
everything.
In everything. And so you really do kind of need this misfit or this black sheep to kind of look at the market in a completely different way by removing the constructs of the existing chassis that serves the market.
I think only the boldest of bold, when you look at market leaders, are willing to disrupt themselves. Yeah. That's what you have to be willing to do.
Yeah.
To do that within, every day is a pull into the center. You have to set this up as an independent organization within an organization to have a shot at doing that. And even still, I think it's a tough recipe to pull off.
Yeah. On another episode in the future, we'll discuss what it is to try to run one of those organizations within a broader organization. That's one thing that you and I have a lot of experience doing. You've mentioned a number of books. You are one of the most prolific readers that I know. I think you told me you have a goal for how many books this year?
Well, I just am trying to do a book a week.
A book a week. So that's like 52 books. Yeah. You're going to take Christmas off or no?
No.
Okay. 52 books this year. What are some of the authors that when they come out with a book, you're like, I want to absorb that?
Yeah. It's a little bit flavor of the day for me, right? Because I'm just kind of constantly churning through them. And I should probably go back to some of the longer standing ones that I should give more credit to. Play Bigger, we've referenced. That's my recent favorite.
Yeah.
It just really, because it brought the words of definition to this experience. When I look at authors, so Simon Sinek, I'm on an auto purchase when he comes out with a new book.
Yep.
Daniel Pink is right in there. Adam Grant is right in there. The Heath brothers are another one that any book they come out with, I'm going to read. From a business standpoint, those are the authors right now. Jonah Berger's another one that I'm probably, as he comes out with a book, I'm reading it. Mm-hmm. When I look at genres, I'll view it as it's probably a half business. Mm-hmm. And then in the other quarter is going to be biography. Mm-hmm. I think you can there's so much to glean from biographies of leaders over the years. And then 25%, I'll call spiritual health, like my faith's very important. Yeah. And so in that realm, a John Piper comes out with something and I'm going to read it. That's kind of how I break down some of the books that are coming through.
One book that I know that both you and I have read and have discussed at great length is one of the more eccentric business books that I've ever read. It's called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. Yeah. One of the most beautifully, succinctly named books that I've ever come across. And it's by a gentleman by the name of Gordon MacKenzie. Now, Gordon MacKenzie, I think he became famous for how to be creative inside of an organization. His career was at Hallmark in Kansas City, Missouri, kind of the cherubs and the very conservative gift category. And inside of Hallmark, he drove more of the irreverent greeting cards. He was kind of a black sheep within that blue chip. And he wrote a book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball, in which he's got a lot of different concepts about how to coexist as a creative, coexist as a disruptor, coexist as a category creator inside of a large organization. Share a little bit about your experiences with Gordon MacKenzie's book.
Yeah, I think his title was Chief Creative.
I think that's right.
At Hallmark in the heyday, which I'm sorry, Hallmark is saying you're not in your heyday anymore, if you didn't know. But, they're a lead sponsor of this program, just so you're aware. Yeah. Well, they got to know they could get insulted. It's called Grody UnPrOfEsSiOnAL. What resonated so much for me in that was when you're successful at category creation, when you're successful at building a business, what happens? Growth. And what Orbiting the Giant Hairball does, I think, is really start to push into a lot of those contrasts that are going to happen with the large scale. Yeah. Those contrasts that happen with maybe even just the traditional view of things. I loved even reading the book and you think, did I get a used book? Because there's like arrows drawn on this page. And it's like, no, that's just the way he wrote it. And he's just like, why would I have to follow the standard rules of publishing? That really does a good job of starting to expose, here's a current status quo that we're going to have to potentially disrupt. And how do you do that? And so kind of, that visual of that hairball But the fact that there's an orbit around it,
Yeah.
and that it's not a free float into space.
Yep.
We got to be honest about that. There's a current context of that we find ourselves in business or organizationally, and we got to, be able to take that into account.
Yeah. So his principal belief around creation or innovation or disruption was that, like the title of his book, that it needed to orbit a larger organization.
Yeah.
It brings a degree of stability. It brings a degree of credibility. It brings a degree of capital. And so his role that he saw was that Hallmark was a very critical aspect of enabling him to do all of the creative things that he did. But his job was to keep it from touching, keep it from direct connection, that you can get all the benefits of the gravitational force of something large, but keeping it in orbit, keeping it separate to a degree. And to your point, he said, if you go into deep space, you got to raise capital, you got to do all these things. And candidly, in the 80s, it was a lot harder to do
Absolutely.
that than it is today. He takes this balanced approach of saying, hey, you need some of the aspects of the large organization to support creativity, but you can't be totally entangled with those. Another word picture that he uses, which I found very helpful, and I know you and I have talked about it, is he talks about two different org chart types. Now, he's a very visual guy, creative guy, and he talks about, in one hand is a pyramid that is an org chart, and in the other hand is a plum tree as an org chart. And just share with me just kind of your observations, both of his comparison, but then also your own personal experiences in those types of org charts.
Yeah. I mean, this was probably my biggest takeaway from that book. I have used that as I'm building a new organization. The backdrop of the org chart is a tree. So the spoiler from my standpoint is the idea of an organization more like a tree than like a pyramid.
Yeah.
And that the vast majority of org charts we're going to see today still are pyramids.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What's the problem? What's inferred by that, maybe even not explicitly being stated, but it's kind of this smartest people at the top.
Right.
The pyramid is there to support those on top and their decisions. And we're just here to kind of carry out that execution for them.
And so the leader on the top has the best view.
Yep.
The people at the bottom feel the most pressure.
Yep.
And as the pyramid gets higher, it's the top that rises, and the middle is just kind of slowly moving up through that middle. But to your point, it either states explicitly in the organization or it implies that it is the smartest, the all-seeing at the top of the organization.
Right. Right.
Versus a plum tree, which
says, hey, as a leader, we're going to picture those within the trunk.
Yeah.
Potentially some in the roots. The picture also matters of what a pyramid is. What it's actually a bit of it's a symbol of death. It's a tomb.
It is. That's where you put dead things.
That's where you put dead things. And so now what is a tree? It's a living thing, right? We're growing, we're trying to achieve something. And that positional leader is actually there to support these branches that are where all this growth is occurring. And that's maybe more your traditional, call it front lines. So in a business like what I'm a part of now is there's what would be considered sales roles, professional service roles. Myself and some other administrators are more the trunk and the roots, supporting the work, not the other way. So it's still, and I think this is even a good clarification. It's not even flipping a pyramid upside down.
Correct.
It's a complete different view of what is happening.
Correct.
I found myself finding a little bit of distaste with some of our approaches of servant leadership that maybe is just flipping a pyramid upside down, but it's still organizationally this very archaic, pressure-built, inefficient chain of things that is a very different experience than someone that should be out on the branch of a living tree getting to do fun, creative work and what they're actually experiencing.
He talks about pyramid, like the actual words, the language that gets used inside of an org chart that is a pyramid. It talks about looking down at employees and telling them that we got to be more efficient. We got to push higher. We got to push harder. Versus in a plum tree, the leadership is actually looking up at the content creators, at the deliverers of value, and saying, how can I support you? How can I push you higher with growth? Or how can I get you a better view of the market or of the customer? The other part that he highlights, which I think is really good, is just the difference in the actual mechanics of a pyramid and a plum tree. He talks about how in a pyramid, the cuts between the stones are straight, they're precise, they're logical, and they're patternistic, right? So you could pretty much pick up a pyramid from one part of a field, label every stone, move it to the other side of the field, and you could replicate the exact same pyramid. Whereas he talks about with a tree, where exactly do the leaves start and the branch stop, and where does the trunk start? And there's not patternistic. You can't logically look at every tree and say, okay, this is exactly what it should look like. No two trees are the same.
Yeah.
That doesn't, to use a buzzword, that doesn't scale well.
Yeah.
Right? Pyramids scale because you just know to cut more stones the exact same size, just one more higher and one more higher. Whereas how do you curate or how do you scale a tree?
Yeah.
Well, you feed it and you care for it and you nourish it. That language is difficult, I think, for some in executive positions. It
is. I would find myself in a role at Precision Planting, and I feel it immediately with Applis, our new business, that I am a complete novice compared to a number of the people on my team regarding what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And within the pyramid organization,
it's intimidating. It's very intimidating.
It's very intimidating. And it's also a bit off limits. Like if you're a leader, you shouldn't admit that.
Right.
Like, you need to have the answer, and you could get brought in the room by the next level up on the pyramid, and you need to have the answer.
Yep.
And it's not okay to say, well, I'm going to go ask the person that actually does that.
Right.
And defer to them.
Right.
But in a tree, that's what you have to do. And there is a level of release that you have to get comfortable with.
Yes.
And a level of leadership that you have to say, well, how does that really work? But then you also quickly realize, well, if we're going to do anything of impact with some level of speed, that's how it has to happen. It can't all go through a few of us that pretend to know the right answer and be the most discerning about everything regarding what we're doing. Is still a bit unnatural. And I'll find myself having to continue to work through, even as you lead in that way.
Yeah. I've worked both in pyramids and I've also worked in plum trees. Typically, pyramids arrive in businesses that are more stable, in competitive landscapes that are more known. And you can have these 3 and 4 and 5 year discussions around what do you want to be. In a pyramid, you kind of define where on the hierarchy, where on the ladder are you aiming to go. Whereas in a plum tree organization, we don't know what the tree is going to look like in 2 years, 5 years, 7 years. And so if the discussion is far more around, do you see yourself as a branch? Do you see yourself as a leaf? Because as the organization evolves, people are moving towards where that opportunity may be.
Yeah.
Not because necessarily of what the title is, not because of what the span of control is, but really that's where they fit best in their passion or in their conviction of what they want to do.
Yeah. And I think, you're talking to some of the language. Pyramids talk a ton about efficiency and optimization.
Yes.
And within the tree, you're acknowledging that you're not necessarily going to be efficient.
Right.
And that's okay. It's not going to be fully clarified through a job description on who's doing what.
One of the comments that I pulled from McKinsey's book, he says, a living thing must put the needs of its young before its own needs in order to survive to the next generation. As a parent, it's obvious.
Yeah.
Right? Like, of course, I need to care for my children. I want my children to be able to stand on my shoulders to advance themselves and advance their families 2 and 3 generations out. But in that pyramid, it sure doesn't feel like that, right? Oftentimes it's the youngest that sits at the bottom of the organization under the weight of the entire organization. I've been in organizations where flat out the leadership described themselves as predator and described the doers, the individual contributors, as prey.
Yeah.
That they were basically, if incomplete staff work happened, it was their job to eviscerate you in the public forum. And you read a sentence like, an organization must care for its young in order to survive to the next generation. And man, what a difference between how a pyramid organization thinks about its youth and how a plum tree organization thinks about its youth.
Yeah.
Because the youngest part of the tree is at the top. It's at the outer edge, getting the most sun, getting the most experience, getting the most opportunity to see the environment around it. It's not buried 6 feet below surface level, just feeling pressure from above. Yeah.
No, it's a powerful picture. And I think in we've used this statement, that is more of a difference in kind than a difference in degree. When you're talking about that and describing that, this is very far upstream onto how you believe the role of an organization or a leader is defined. It's honestly why I've quit using servant leader quite a bit, because I've gotten to the place to say it's like saying it's a big giant. No, you can't be a leader if you don't serve. That's the only way leadership is done. Leadership is more stewardship than privilege, but we believe it's been privileged. Like I get to work into a level of leadership that now I've got privilege that you don't below me. That's the pyramid talking.
Right.
And it's wrong.
That's right.
It's wrong. We say, well, I'm going to develop the skill of servant leadership so that I can be a little more caring to my people. But at the end of the day, if they're still the prey and I'm the predator, it doesn't matter how caring you are. You're better with the shot when you kill them. Great. Right. Like that's what I learned to do.
That $100 gift card doesn't cover up the absolute public embarrassment you're saying? Oh,
right. Doesn't quite, Yeah. It can't be understated how big of a difference that is of what's being described there.
One of my favorite lines from the entire book, I know we're spending a fair bit of time, but it's chapter 19. It's entitled Orville Wright, and it's one sentence long, and it says, Orville Wright did not have a pilot's license. It's just to say that the first person to do something, he didn't have permission to do it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times inside of a pyramid, there's 500 checks and balances to go through that is largely built to maintain the status quo.
And I think category and the idea of category creation, there is the statement, I think in Play Bigger, that would say most of the time category creators come from outside the category.
Yeah.
And Orville Wright is a fantastic example as you study the difference between what Langley had given to him and the full backing of the Department of Defense and resources. And in the meantime, 2 bike mechanics are able to crush it and end up being the first to flight.
Circling back to a question we've already discussed a little bit, for people listening to the podcast that presently work in a pyramid organization and they hear this plum tree language, is there a way for their team of 5, for their team of 10 to operate in a plum tree way inside of a pyramid?
I think the answer is yes, but I do think it is probably these groups of 5 within these pyramids that you have a level of autonomy to lead the way you want to lead. And you just have to recognize that some of these systems are going to be set up in a way that is going to be a little bit at war with that thinking, but you can probably pull it off. I think if you are too high up in the pyramid, it gets more and more difficult.
Because there's just so much visibility high in the pyramid, and there's so much need for conformity high in the pyramid.
Yeah, but I think someone that's looking at a team and saying, how do I lead my team within this? I think you can. I think there's aspects of it. And I think probably both you and I would say there's going to be certain things that you won't have the autonomy fully to do.
Yes.
And you just get, that's okay. But then there's other areas that you can really start moving that way. And I believe that could be done.
My own personal passion, I would say, above the product has always been the team that I get to take the field with.
Yeah.
The people that I get to spend most of my waking hours with. And having been a team leader earlier in my career inside of a large pyramid, there is the opportunity to start practicing some of these aspects of leadership.
Yeah.
Of what does that one-on-one look like with the young employee? What is the career advice you pass to that employee? And no, you don't have full autonomy, but even Gordon McKenzie said you don't need and can't have full autonomy. You need to be orbiting that hairball. A team leader or a group leader inside of a large organization, there absolutely is opportunities to look at a Gordon McKenzie, to look at other organizations and say, how can I plant maybe a small plum tree here where I live on the pyramid?
Right. I think so. And I think, if you just look at the fundamental skill of building trust, extending and building trust within a team, that's a skill, not a character attribute. I mean, I think I viewed as trust more as that's a trustworthy person or not. that's very separate from being a leader that can extend and build trust within a team and within people. And I think that is something that is very critical of the Plum Tree as an example.
Yeah.
You are acknowledging, I'm trusting this creative out here, this engineer, this salesperson to be executing and doing things that I won't even understand if I'm doing it right, but I'm extending trust. That's a skill that you can develop, and you don't need to be given authority to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So again, back to the within the pyramid, if I could encourage someone to where would I start on that? Push into the idea of what does it look like? What's the skill of building and extending trust to look like? Again, that's separate from how trustworthy am I or how trustworthy are my people, but what am I doing to actually build that? And I think that's partly reflective of a healthy plum tree.
That's great. Going back to your history just a little bit. Now, as I remember early in your career, you actually decided to leave the workforce for a few years after you'd been at the engineering services business. You actually decided to go pursue an MBA. There's a lot of pros and cons to kind of leaving the workforce, continuing your education. Talk me through what that process was. What was your aim in pursuing an advanced degree?
There's probably a whole episode's worth of conversation around the education system, and us as parents, are both walking this road now as I have a high school senior and thinking about that. If I go back for my journey, I would say I always knew I wanted to run an entrepreneurial business and wanted to continue to learn and grow in that. As I shared, started in a sales role, but ultimately with the goal of, leading an organization, whatever that might look like. I'd worked for about 3 years and had some opportunities to move into some different roles, Six Sigma at the time, black belt, going down that path, or some other leadership roles, but feeling like, man, I think I need to learn and experience a little bit more. At the same time, I'm asking big origin life questions too of, why am I here? For me, my faith is a very critical part of that answer. And the fact that I'm a pilgrim on this earth and the Lord's given me what I believe are some talents, and how do I use those? And I kind of wrestled with if business was an appropriate place for those or not.
As opposed to going into the ministry.
Maybe a vocational ministry type of role or something like that. And had gotten very peaceful about, no, I feel called into business ministry and using my gifts in this way, and wanted to get just further equipped in that, both as a businessman and as a person of faith. I wanted to really grow in both those areas. Up until that point, those had always been a little bit separate, as far as schooling and my church life or faith life. But in the midst of that, a mentor of mine gave me a book called Great Commission Companies that I read and really resonated with me. It was about intentional integration in business and ministry. The authors of that book were two professors from a Biola MBA program out in Southern California that was very intentional about this integration. So you'd go out there and you'd have business ethics from a seminary professor and some of this stuff. I didn't want to go to Bible class and get bad business teaching.
Got it.
I didn't want to go get great business teaching without an eternal perspective of the worldview lens through it. Okay. And so what I thought was a program that would do that was going to say, I think I'm going to get challenged as a business person. I'm going to grow in my understanding of business and entrepreneurship, specifically building businesses, early stage businesses, but then have that through a lens of an eternal perspective. So my wife and I, we'd been married for about 3 years at the time too. And we both quit our jobs in Central Illinois, moved to Southern California. Little did we know, we started our family out there.
Right.
A lot happened, being a really neat season for us. I would say that was actually the most valuable education I ever had, because I had a much stronger level of application. Back to the kind of experience plus theory. Yeah. Those 3 years of experience were invaluable for me when I went back to get that MBA, because there's just a bit of go back to Strength Finders, belief's a real important thing for me. And belief ends up being, I see it play out for me in a couple different ways. One of which is, once I feel like learning this thing, and if it doesn't have any value for what I believe to be what I'm working on, and that I lose interest so fast. And so you're able to filter all of that education through an experience lens that was, for me, ended up being super valuable, a great growing experience. And just having a few years of work experience was well worth it to step away, do that. It was a working MBA program. So I did find a job out there and was able to, you're constantly using application of a current work environment to filter through what you're learning. And so it really really propelled me quite a bit in my career and understanding of business.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple times the combination of experience and theory leading to beliefs. Are there any rough experiences that you've picked up from leaders over the years that you take them through your experience set? Have there been experiences that you've picked up that you say, I'm glad I experienced that because I now know how that impacts people or how that can cost in motivation or inspiration of an organization?
I think there's a few that I think of. I mean, I do think first and foremost, I'll just reiterate what we talked about of the organization of a pyramid compared to a plum tree. I feel as if I maybe had a few leaders along the way that I felt like portrayed the persona of you can't admit that you don't know. You can't admit that someone else might be better equipped to answer that and you might need to defer, or that the room could be the smartest person in the room. Some of those type of things. I think experiencing the negative side of that early on as a young, energetic student and just like not being able to reconcile, I could, it's not even my idea, but this idea over here by this author kind of clearly contradicts that, but it feels like pride is standing maybe in the way of being able to set that aside. One of the just very practical things I feel like I learned early on was this temptation when in the hiring process, of trying to paint the best picture possible, telling a candidate what they want to hear and what you really want them to experience. I'll give an example like, hey, you're not going to have to travel much in this role. We want you to be at home. And then the reality is that experience is actually pretty different.
Yeah.
I think going through that a few times, I've come out of that with the idea of just being very direct and actually looking to sell people out of the role compared to trying to sell them into the role. And saying, I would rather be extremely candid about the negatives of what this role is going to be, what our organization is. I'm just going to start like pushing in and exposing some of like, here's the problem about working here. Here's what I see people get frustrated with, or here's what I don't think I'm very good at. And so just kind of flipping that the other way. I think early on, I experienced a little bit of being sold situations that didn't really live up to them. And just watching that, experiencing that as an employee being, really frustrating.
I know both you and I as leaders have felt that exact same temptation. Because you're so excited, you're so bought in, you're really looking forward to the person joining. And so you're sitting across the table and the adrenaline gets going and you've got the sales pitch memorized because you've given it to 100 people over 10 years. And you fall into that same trap. It's interesting. I'm listening to a book by William Vanderbloemen called Culture Wins, and he spends an entire chapter on that exact thing. He's the founder of a talent search organization. And he talked about how early on he was so excited and so passionate that he would actually give the interviewee an experience that wasn't real. He conveyed an organization that, those elements existed, but it was absent of other elements in it as well. He actually has now set up the interview process so that he doesn't have great access to a lot of the interviewees because he's such a believer in the organization. And because he's the founder, he knows he doesn't experience the totality of the organization. To your same point, it's easy to oversell in a hiring situation and end up really picking somebody that doesn't fit, and then they're looking and saying, this isn't at all what I signed up for.
Right. No, I think that's really good. I'll have to add his book to the list. I have seen the temptation, and this is where I think leadership as stewardship also is helpful, because I think there are times I kind of know I could talk someone into this, and that's a misuse as a steward. If I view it as stewardship, but if it's not really fully accurate, if it's not what's going to end up being the best for them, it's misusing my position if I do that. And that has been a mindset shift for me.
So what is an aspect of leadership that you are presently working on?
I think presently working on the difference between what is enough communication and clarity of vision, of call it commander's intent. So with the plum tree idea, I have also come to recognize that full autonomy and empowerment, that we talk about that as kind of like the heightened level of leadership. And I've realized that's not helpful. Like empowering someone that doesn't have a clarity of where they're supposed to go, that doesn't have access to the resources that they need, is being a really poor leader.
Correct.
Part of building this new organization, Apollos, that is a number of really experienced professionals that know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis in their specific lane.
Mm-hmm.
But we're actually trying to do it different too than what they've done for maybe the last 20 years.
Sure. Because you're trying to create a new category.
Correct.
Right.
We're trying to create a new category by bringing some services together, developing a product in the midst of that. Call it situational leadership. I think that framework can be really helpful.
Yes.
I have a default position of coach, and I have to recognize that there are times that like being a coach is not always a heightened level. It's not like, oh yeah, I like to empower and really let these people grow and flourish out at the end of the tree. But I need to recognize those same people that are very capable of that in our current context need more directive help to give clarity about what we're trying to do and where some of the guardrails are to work within.
Yeah.
And that's the area that I'm really trying to work on right now, is what does that look like?
And you referenced the situational leadership model, another really helpful model, which is to point to kind of fast overview. There's 4 different leadership approaches, and really you're looking at not just the employees' knowledge or their ability, but the specific environment that they're in. And in one environment, they may easily take a high level command and they can run for months or years without a lot of correction. That same employee in a very new environment, it's actually most caring to give them pretty directive and feedback. And so I think that's something that I myself, I don't know that I'll ever stop learning in that environment, but that's really trying to discern the employee, their ability, their desire, their preferred work environment, and then the environment that they're in, and trying to match those to one another.
Right. I can default to just the employee and think, oh, this experienced person doesn't need that directive type of leadership, which is correctly addressing what maybe is the baggage have come from, which is directive leadership for people that don't need it, within the pyramid type of structure, which is like, you can't think, we think for you. We're going to direct you. And this person, you're holding them back. But recognizing in this very new venture where this tree's just trying to go, they're kind of like, why, I need that. I
need some direction.
I need some direction.
Yeah.
And the context matters a lot. It's not just the employee. It starts there, but taking into account the situation and some of that additional context and being willing to float within that. Because normally you'll get accolades and more appreciation as that coach than the directive.
Yeah.
But you need to recognize that's not always the best. And that's not always the best way to lead.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Mr. Kauffman, I really appreciate you coming by. You and I have worked together for a lot of years. We've had a lot of these conversations over lunch and over conference rooms of just our passion and our conviction for helping an organization by helping its employees to see the mission, to grow in their own personal experience, and to know the customer. And so I just really appreciate you coming and sharing some of your experience with all 3 people that listen to this podcast.
I love it. No, I appreciate the opportunity. And like you said, we've had a lot of fun together and we're both still growing.
Yeah. Awesome. Have a good one.
Thank you.
For those that wish to offer this podcast lucrative sponsorship deals, I can be reached via my email at justin@grody.io. For those concerned with the numerous industries and companies that were disparaged in this episode, you can reach either Justin Kauffman or myself at our MySpace pages. Thank you for your time. Let's do it again soon.